Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the FPCJ briefing. Today we are very happy to have Professor Takatoshi Ito of the Graduate School of Economics of the University of Tokyo with us. And the title of the briefing is Abenomics and the Outlook for the Japanese Economy. And today's briefing will be conducted in English only. And before we listen to what Professor Ito has to say, just as usually, please turn your cell phones to the silent mode. Okay? And if you are ready, yeah, please.
Sure. Good morning. Today I'm assigned to talk about Abenomics and the outlook for the Japanese economy, and I have asked to distribute the PowerPoint printouts and the some of the my writings in Financial Times and the other publication. So I go with the PowerPoint and referring to other publications. So I'm sure you have heard hundreds of times about Abenomics in the last 12 months, and so there's no reason to spend too much time on the overall picture. But the this three arrows is the what Abenomics consists of: inflation targeting and aggressive monetary policy. The first arrow, and second arrow is fiscal stimulus, but the flexible fiscal stimulus. And the third arrow is a growth strategy. So we have seen the first arrow hitting the target in the first half of this year, and actually starting from the November last year. And then fiscal stimulus and sort of the short-term fiscal stimulus and medium-term consolidation, that is sort of the bent arrow, was working right now, and I think the it is going through the path which Prime Minister Abe intended. And the third arrow, growth strategy, is, I think many observers would say, yet to be released. So that's the sort of the positioning of those three arrows hitting the target to yet to be released. The inflation targeting and aggressive monetary policy is designed to create the environment of negative real interest rates to stimulate the investment and housing activities. So this is sort of common to any other central banks which are struggling to get out of stagnation and deflationary fear. Japan, is, of course, has been in deflation the last 15 years. U.S. had a scare moment, but never went into the deflation. UK and the continental Europe also had a scare in getting into deflation, but they learned lessons from Japan, so they took aggressive policy before they got into the deflation. Japan is a severest case that it has been 15 years of deflation and tried to get out of it. So this first arrow is a bold attempt to get out of deflation by creating the inflation expectation and backing it with the very aggressive expansion of the balance sheet of the Bank of Japan. Yes, there is a controversy about the effectiveness of this quantitative easing, and I think that you've heard from the US and also UK about those effectiveness debate. Same in Japan, but I think the Mr. Abe and Governor Kuroda are convinced that to use balance sheet is one instrument, and that would affect the expectation of the people about future inflation rates, and accordingly the exchange rate and the asset prices. And as the next two figures, one on the yen, US yen dollar rate, and the other one is stock prices, I think that this first arrow worked beautifully, causing the yen dollar yen depreciation vis-a-vis the US dollar, and stock price increases. So I would say the proponents of this inflation targeting cum aggressive monetary policy, proponents won over the skeptics, and these yen depreciation and stock price increases produced strong recovery in consumption expenditures in the first half of this year. And as you see, as you are living in Tokyo and you see the people getting happier and people are spending more, and so it's a real game changer. It was a game changer, I think. Of course, the some of those yen depreciation and stock price increases are due to the correction of the overvaluation of the yen and too much depressed stock prices. So it's a correction plus the expectation of the future monetary policy and the economy. But those asset prices have the elements of self-fulfilling prophecy that if everybody believes that yen will depreciate or the stock price will increase, then that will happen, right? So it is a correction in the fundamentals plus the trust in the future monetary policy, which changed the expectation of the people, which actually realized the expectation. So it was, I think, really interesting from the economic theory point of view, interesting interesting development of the intended economic policy being realized. And I think Mr. Abe and Mr. Kuroda are very happy about these results. And central bank balance sheet, the third figure, you have it in front of you, shows the size of the central bank balance sheets of BOE, Federal Reserve, ECB, and BOJ. What's striking is that balance sheet of the BOJ did not increase at all after the Lehman shock. All those jump in the BOE, FRB, ECB occurred in the last quarter of 2008, first quarter of 2009, are due to the reaction to the what we call Lehman shock, right? So Lehman Brothers collapsed and the global financial system went into crisis, and central bank responded. Okay? Bank of Japan didn't. Why? They reasoned that Lehman shock and global financial crisis was due to the financial systemic crisis in the West. So it was the AIG, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, all those too big to fail institutions went into crisis, which the FRB and BOE, ECB tried to help stabilize the financial system. Financial system in Japan was not in crisis, and the Bank of Japan didn't feel that it was necessary to expand balance sheet. But the consequence was that yen appreciated from about 110 yen per dollar to 80 yen per dollar in half year to a month. And trade channel, not financial channel, but the trade channel worked to put Japanese economy into severe stagnation, recession. So the decline in GDP actually was the largest in Japan compared to US and European countries. And later there was, the European sovereign crisis, which put the euro to sink and yen to go up further. So Japan from 2009 to 2012 was the very much of the stagnation in contrast to the Koizumi years. And, well, it's sort of external shocks, yes. It was a Lehman and Greece and others. But I think the BOJ not responding to those crises in the West was contributing factor, allowing yen to appreciate and stock price to decline. And it was, kind of 4 years too late, but this expansion of balance sheet by BOJ is trying to rectify what was wrong with the BOJ in the previous regime. Okay, so that's the first arrow. Second arrow is the flexible fiscal stimulus, and my interpretation is that this has two parts: the short-run fiscal stimulus and medium-term fiscal consolidation. Okay, so it's a arrow which goes curve to the target, and short-term fiscal stimulus was needed because government wants to make it a big push with the first arrow to raise the growth rate in the first quarter and especially in the second quarter of this year. So this was started with the so-called supplementary budget, which was enacted in February this year, and disbursement was concentrated in the second quarter of this year, which contributed to the good high growth rates in the second quarter. So first quarter was big increase in consumption. Second quarter was consumption and government expenditure, and they raised the growth rate to around 4% quarter-to-quarter growth rate annualized. The first quarter and second quarter around 4%, right? So that was consumption and government expenditure, right? So again, there was a skeptics that people said, "Oh, this is an old LDP coming back, spending government expenditure on wasteful infrastructure and so on." Defense was that it was not spent on the new wasteful infrastructure, but it was spent on the repair and maintenance and also the reconstruction in the tsunami hit area. So the content question was there, but I don't think that was a severe problem. Anyway, so the growth rate was up, which was probably more politically important for July Council, the House of Councilors election, and also the decision of a go or no-go of the consumption tax rate hike, which we saw the conclusion last week. So this was, again, the short-term stimulus to push this expenditure, but to make sure that medium-term consolidation will be in place, which is a go decision of the consumption tax rate hike. And consolidation is needed because the fiscal situation in Japan, as you know, is terrible, right? So this is a bit of the long-term view of the government budget, how the expenditure and tax revenues are doing from 1975 to most recent. And if you talk to the budget people in Ministry of Finance, they put a nickname on this graph. It's alligator's mouth, which opened up and stuck there and never closed. And this is the this happened since 1990, right? So looks okay until 1990. Then this mouth started to open and getting wider and wider, right? So what was 1990? 1990 was the year that the bubble started to burst. So the bubble burst. Of course, the tax revenues go down, but expenditure never went down because of the inertia and the promised expenditures, Social Security expenditure going up automatically, and so on. There was a brief improvement during the Koizumi years, 2001 to 2006, and but after that, the Lehman shock came, and Japan spent again to support the economy. So this is every year the huge amount of the deficits are financed by government bond issues. The snapshot of 2013 budget is next page, and as you see, about half of the government expenditures are financed by new bond issues. It's like you're spending half of your monthly spending by credit card and just keep going, accumulating those credit card balances, and immediately you understand it's not sustainable. Sometime in the future, that if this continues, then fiscal crisis like Greece will happen. So this government or any other past governments knew about it, but there was no sort of strong, determined prime minister to correct this situation. Fortunately, after many years of inaction, last year the three leaders of the three parties agreed to raise consumption tax rates. And that was a three-party agreement, which it was agreed when the DPJ was in the government, but the DPJ, LDP, and New Kome party agreed that consumption tax rate should be increased to avoid the fiscal crisis in, 10 years or something, before too late, right? Now, as you saw during this summer, that big debate about whether this tax rate hike should be implemented as scheduled or not, right? Schedule was there last year already, that the law was passed and consumption tax rate would increase to 8% next April and to 10% in October 2015. But why do we have to debate again, right? That was a big question. And one legal reason is that there was not footnote, but the provisional provisional article 18. It's like a footnote in the law, which says that go or no go should be decided considering the economic conditions. It was interpreted that if the growth rate and unemployment rate of those conditions are bad, then implementation should be suspended. That was the interpretation of that provision. Okay, no numbers attached, so it's up to interpretation of that provision. So the special advisor to the cabinet, Mr. Hamada, Professor Hamada, and Mr. Honda started to argue openly that this law should be suspended and rate hike should be gradual, and for example, 1% by 1% a year for 5 years to raise to 10% instead of 3 plus 2, right? So we had a debate on as scheduled or modified. Okay, this went on for 2 or 3 months. This is a recent thing, so you remember clearly. And the big show was, I think, the last week of August, that there was a hearing of the 60 experts, and I was one of them, and grouped into 7 groups, and we had a presentation, a Q&A between the experts and 2 ministers, Aso Amari and the Governor Kuroda, and 2 members of the Council of Fiscal and Economic Policy. So for 1 week, so Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, that 2 hours each, that group of 7 to 9 experts on this side, and the ministers and governor on the other side, and we are each was given 8 minutes to present, and then Q&A between those members of Fiscal Policy Council, and also we are encouraged to debate among ourselves in the experts. So that was sort of the it was not show, but it was a sort of a open debate. It was not open; it was closed. But it was a mechanism, let's say, mechanism or framework that the government made sure that how the experts, so-called experts, think about this go or no-go decision. And of course, Professor Hamada, he was also one of the experts, and Mr. Honda argued to modify the rate hike schedule, and including myself, those who think the schedule is okay, argued that the as scheduled rate hike. Okay, so after that, again, 1 more month for Mr. Abe to decide, and October 1st, he announced that he was convinced that as schedule is a good policy. Okay, so that's 9 days ago. Okay, so what was the point of this as scheduled or delay? Well, Mr. Honda and Professor Hamada argued that economy is still fragile. Fragile? Well, the growth rate is 4% in the first half, and how, what else could be dreamed of in the economic growth in this mature economy? 4% is a very high number. So we argued that economy is strong enough and will withstand rate hike. Mr. Honda and Professor Hamada argued that the last time consumption tax rate was hiked from 3% to 5%, 2% increase, in 1987, they argued this created a recession in 1998. We argued that was wrong interpretation of the rate hike. The recession in 1998 was caused by the Asian financial crisis that started in the summer, and Japanese own banking crisis that started in November 1997. So recession in 1998 was all or almost all caused by these financial crises. It was Japanese version of the Lehman shock back in November 1997. Okay, so we argued that that 1997-8 experience is not the good lesson for what we are discussing, because Japanese financial system this time is a good one. Then we also argued that this provision of which, provisional Article 18, which says the government can suspend the law to increase the tax rate, is there, but it's not automatic to amend it. The law says you can suspend it, but law doesn't say you can introduce a new schedule automatically. You have to pass a new law. You can suspend 3 + 2, but to make it 1% for 5 times, you need a new law. Okay? So if that was the decision, if that had been a decision, then right now we would have been debating how to raise the consumption tax, those arguing 1% times 5 years, or maybe some people argue that 5 percentage point at one time. So modified schedule was not agreed. Of course, Honda, Hamada, they argued one way, but there are other ways. And there are people who said no tax increase, right? It's a Green Tea Party in Japan, I call them, no tax increase. But anyway, so we would have been debating how to, whether the consumption tax will be raised this week. But fortunately that this was avoided, right? So this fall, this autumn, should be a growth policy diet, growth policy parliament. So to do that, this modifying tax rate should have been stopped. And fortunately, Prime Minister Abe did stop that debate. Arrow number 3, growth strategy. Right. So this is the most important arrow. I agree, but this is mostly difficult arrow to launch because it touches on all those structures and regulations and that that have been protecting vested interest groups, and it's very difficult to implement those structural reform, regulatory reforms, right? And also, there are many items which have been mentioned. There's a June 14th report of growth strategy. I'm sure you've seen it. It's a big report which probably listing 150 or 200 items of the potential growth strategy items. And it's very difficult for us and for you to see what's going on and what is the high priority thing, what is the most growth enhancing measure. There's no sort of priority among those 150 or 200 lists in that report. So there was a market was disappointed on June 14th that stock price went down that afternoon. And I don't blame the market. And so I think Prime Minister Abe tries to recover from that disappointment and try to, I hope, that prioritize those growth strategies and put some prominent ones and push through the legislations to change those things. So among those areas, several things have been, I think, will be prioritized as most important reforms. One is agriculture, and another is health and medical care, and energy. I think those are the natural targets to reform. And agriculture is important because that is related to the TPP negotiation. So TPP is the free trade plus alpha among the Pacific countries, and vigorous negotiation is going on right now in Brunei. And unfortunately, President Obama missed the trip to East Asia due to that budget and debt ceiling problem in the Congress in the US. But we hope that this TPP negotiations will be concluded hopefully by the end of this year, but maybe delayed to next spring. But this will be a very important step for Japan for several reasons. But first, that for the Japanese exporting industries, that the lowering the tariff in the other nations are very important. And that will promote Japanese exporting industries to stay in Japan as a production base. This also promotes the reforms in agriculture, because the agriculture cannot be protected, quote unquote, protected by high tariff rates, because that violates the spirit of TPP. So agricultural reform has to go along in parallel with the TPP negotiation. Healthcare, medical care is also important to lower the cost without hurting the quality of service. And to do that, we need reform in the how those medical services are delivered, technology, and also more healthcare workers, possibly foreign labor. Introduced in Japan. Energy, obviously, is important because in the face of this problem in Fukushima. I missed one another item, which is labor force. Okay, so there are several aspects of labor force because of the demography that we are facing, the decline, severe decline in the working age population. We have so-called baby boomer generation. I'm one of them, unfortunately. And so we are retiring very soon. So 65 is a forced retirement age, and massive workforce is between the age of 61 to 65. So in 5 years, we are all retired. I'll be on the beach in some maybe Phuket, enjoying my life in 5 years. Right? So massive labor force will drop out, and what will Japanese industries do without those workers, able workers, right? And some reforms are necessary to encourage women to work more, especially women at the child caring years, age between 25 and 40, which Japanese women tend to drop out from the labor force. So obviously, child care and other measures are necessary to support the working mothers. Also, there must be some mechanism to keep those 65 and older workers who are able to work and willing to work to continue working. And some ways, the wage adjustment and how the companies can selectively ask workers to go on is necessary. So it's not raising the retirement age, but rehiring at lower wage is being discussed. So raising in retirement age is more difficult, which I think should be done, but politically it's more difficult, and that touches on the social security system altogether, which is also needed, but not this fall, probably, right? So the growth strategy, we need, for growth strategy, we need to work on the labor side, capital, and technological progress. So we need to promote innovations and so on. So all those things. So it's not, I'm sympathetic, yes, that all those 150 or 200 items are listed. But again, I think that politically, Mr. Abe has to choose and push most difficult ones in the coming 6 to 12 months. I think those are the key window of opportunity for structural reform. So in all, I'm optimistic about how the Abenomics will work in the next 6 to 12 months. The growth rate will continue to be on the high range for the Japanese economy, and reforms will proceed. Okay, and there will be a bumpy ride next year because of the consumption tax rate hike. There will be a boom, rush to buy boom in the first quarter next year. There will be withdrawal of consumption in the second quarter. Many people mistake it as a recession in the second quarter next year, but it is not recession. It is a mini cycle, which after you aggregate first quarter and second quarter, it shouldn't be a recession. And there will be a recovery from third quarter on. And growth strategy is a key. It should be, growth strategy should be legislated and implemented this year, the rest of this year, but fruits will come in next year, hopefully by third quarter. In the longer run horizon, the even 10% consumption tax rate is not enough to balance the budget. I think at least 15 and hopefully 20% of the consumption tax rate is necessary to stabilize and bring down the debt to GDP ratio. Of course, European countries, they have 20 to 25% VAT rate, so it's not unheard of in the economic policy, global economic policy world. So if Japan wants to keep the European type social welfare, Japan needs European type consumption tax rate, and that message has to be delivered honestly and has to win the support of the public. There's one very good news to this rate hike: Olympic Games, right? So as you know, this is today is the 49th anniversary of the Tokyo Olympic Games, 1964. Today was opening day, October 10, right? Do you remember what happened the year after Olympic Games, 1964? Sorry, it's 1965. Okay, there's a huge recession. After Olympic construction boom, everybody, the boom was past. It's like a bubble and burst. So the year after was a recession. What did Japanese government do? They issued first government bonds in the post-Second World War. So up until 1964, the Olympic Games, Japanese budget was balanced every year, no government bonds. 1965 was first year of getting into this, borrowing mood. And after that 49 years, debt just soared, skyrocketed, and we now have the 200% debt to GDP ratio, right? Now 2020, we have to be smarter this time, right? We should be smarter this time. We should raise VAT, consumption tax, before the Olympic Games so that we can spend and smooth the post-Olympic game recession, right? Now, we can learn from Australia, which actually introduced VAT, they call GST, 1 month before Sydney Olympic Games 2000. 0% to 10%. And they collected consumption tax from foreign visitors. That was the smartest move that Australia did. So we copied that in 2019. We raised it to 20%, and we get all those revenues from foreign athletes and tourists. That would be my recommendation. Then, so what started in 64 Olympic Games will end it in 2020 Olympic Games. That is that problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ito. Now Q&A session. We will receive questions from the press people. And would you please raise your hand and please use microphone and give us your name and affiliation and ask your question with the microphone. And okay. Anyone? Okay.
Carsten Germes from Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung in Germany. Maybe I always meet the wrong people. You said people are getting happier and it's a real game changer. This might appear to some parts like stock market, Toyota and the big exporting business. Talking to small and medium-sized enterprise, I up to now get a quite different picture. Most of them tend to remain in this what Mr. Shirakawa once called some sort of structural pessimism. They have overproduction, they have some sort of hidden unemployment because more employed people than they need. And this seems to be a problem for the domestic market. Do you really think this could change and create a sustainable growth in the course of the next 2 years without essential structural reforms?
As I mentioned, the third arrow, the growth strategy, is most important. But to introduce the third arrow, we needed first arrow and second arrow. Make the stock market higher and wealth effect takes place. And yes, maybe middle income to upper income, they have stocks, so they feel happy and spend. But you know, it will reach those small SMEs and others in a year or two. I think there are things that there are sectors and regions which gets first benefit and others who get second stage benefits and so on. So I argue and I believe that those spreading spillover to every part of Japan and sector will happen. And my argument would be that this environment is much better than deflationary environment. If you know, I don't think their life became worse because of the depreciation and stock price increase. So this is slightly better situation even for them. And the question is, would they feel much of the effect? I would say in a year or two, yes. And if that doesn't happen, then that sector shouldn't be there. They should change the job. That's what structural reform means.
Okay, next question, please. Yeah, gentleman over there.
Mike Fern from CCTV. What are your thoughts on cutting the corporate tax? Because 38% is the highest amongst industrialized nations. The Prime Minister says it needs to be seriously looked at, but the Finance Ministry is saying you can't cut it because we need that revenue. What sort of scale of cuts would be beneficial to unlock CapEx, but not cut off that huge revenue stream that we need to balance the budget?
That's a very good question, and which is being debated right now. My prediction is that they will introduce this 1-year front loading of the cancellation of the special surcharge on the corporate tax, which was introduced to finance the reconstruction. So that will be done. Minister of Finance is happy, is agreeable to that compromise because it is 1-year thing, right? So front loading, so the revenue loss compared to the benchmark is just for 1 year. So that's fine with them. They don't smile, but that's fine with them. For the permanent cut in the corporate tax rates, they are still resisting. And I think they have to be convinced that consumption tax increase goes in smoothly, so to 8% and to 10%. And revenues start to flow in, growth rate picks up, and the natural increase in the tax revenues go in. Then probably, they're convinced that some cuts is okay. But there's a big philosophical divide between Minister of Finance and METI. That METI would argue that lowering the tax you stimulates the production and pays for it itself the tax rate cut by revenue increase. Minister of Finance doesn't believe that in this area. So, it may go into the political decision, and Mr. Abe may take the side of the METI, but not this fall, probably. My opinion? I would say cutting a corporate tax rate is a good thing, but giving it right now maybe a bit too early because again the deficit is so large that giving it to the revenue loss is difficult, and also politically it doesn't look good to increase consumption tax rate and cutting corporate tax rates. It's like hurting consumers, benefiting huge corporations, and numbers are not like that. But it appears that government needs for the big businesses and not for the consumers. So timing right now is not good timing.
Okay, the gentleman in the front.
Hello, Martin Fackler with the New York Times. In your discussion of the third arrow, one thing I was curious about was entrepreneurship, which I think Prime Minister Abe has spoken about. I really had two questions. One is there enough on entrepreneurship in the third arrow, and what would you suggest Japan do if there's not? And the second is the first arrow, the creation of an inflationary expectation. This, of course, encourages risk-taking and this sort of thing. Is this also going to have an impact on entrepreneurship, and has it already had an impact?
There's a huge debate whether entrepreneurship in Japan is why entrepreneurship is coming out in Japan compared to, say, U.S. And I don't think there's a consensus on the determinants of the entrepreneurship. Some blame university, like University of Tokyo, and not doing the good education on those entrepreneurship. Some blame the tax framework, which does not give subsidies to those new startup companies, and some blame traditional sort of business culture in Japan. So it is, I think, very difficult to write a prescription when you don't agree on the cause of the problems. And myself, I'm I'm not convinced that you can do very quickly to change the situation. I believe the university system in Japan is too rigid compared to the U.S. universities, for example, a professor cannot form a company and become a president of the company on the offshoot of the technology from the university. But I think trying to find ways that entrepreneurship or the new startup, venture capital, and so on, can be promoted in tax incentives or special district or something like that. Inflation expectation, I think, if that is successfully raised, of course, the best protection for inflation is stock market. So there will be a increase in there will be a portfolio shift from bank deposits to a stock funds and so on. So that will help in general the capital markets, and some of them will go into the risk capital, including venture capital. So the capital markets reform and capital markets promotion, including GPIF, will be good for venture capital and entrepreneurship.
Okay, next, please.
Thank you, Professor Ito. My name is Stefano Carrero, the Italian Economic Daily. How far the government will go in labor market reform? I mean, would you agree that some expectations, especially in financial circles abroad, are excessive on this regard? And what do you think of the idea of creating kind of two different labor markets, one in general and one for special economic areas, in which Japanese that will be hired by foreign company would be laid off, possibly, and in the other, and on the other side, I mean, for the rest of the country, not. What do you think of this idea?
So we need Mario Monti coming to Japan and write labor reform law for us. It is, laying off or firing workers is very difficult in Japan, not because of law, because of the precedents in court ruling. So it's very difficult to change that court rulings precedents, and so to override that, yes, we need to have a new law which explicitly allows the conditions of the separation and with some compensation, monetary compensation. So that is probably proposed and pushed through. My guess is maybe not this this parliamentary session, but probably next year. But some ways of phrasing it, not to sound like, here's the money, take it and leave us. That doesn't look very good in Japanese culture. So, but you have to phrase it some ways that those amiable separation with monetary compensation, that has to be introduced. So it's not probably outright firing power, but the conditions that companies can exercise this and conditions of the monetary rule, make it a rule for some monetary compensation for the separation for the companies under stress. That is possible, and I don't like that special zone. If this is a good thing, you should do it nationwide from the start.
Okay.
Daniel Leutsink, freelance correspondent with the Dutch financial daily Het Financiële Dagblad. If you would have a free hand, what would you what would be your fourth arrow? Thank you.
Fourth arrow. Well, I think we have to launch the third arrow first before going to fourth arrow. No, I think the third arrow could be multiple, right? So I'm not sure that fourth arrow is needed if the multiple third arrows hit the target. I think the if we can achieve this agriculture, medical care, and women and energy, then I think that will be sufficient to raise the potential growth rate of Japanese economy and achieve the fiscal sustainability. So hopefully, fourth arrow is not needed.
Next, please. Okay.
I think since we're using metaphors, kind of the shoe that hasn't dropped is wages. I mean, the gentleman talked about how companies have been spending more, and there's been, on the corporate side, I think some good cheer and optimism. But it seems that until wages rise, that this really won't spread through the rest of the economy into the consumer section. What is your thoughts on wages? Will they go up? Is there enough here to bring up wages?
Yeah. So big puzzle is that corporations are doing well. They're piling up the financial reserves. Corporate saving, corporate deposit into the financial institutions are rising fast, and they're repaying loans from the banks. So the balance between banks and corporations are doing something very strange, that corporations are getting cash rich, and they're depositing those into banks. So we need those money to be mobilized either as a wage increase, raising dividends, or invest. So I think the government is trying to find ways that one of those three things will happen. And hopefully that this wage increase, persuasion by the Prime Minister to raise wages will succeed. Of course, some people may think that this is strange. It should be left to private sector negotiations. That's not something that government shouldn't intervene. But this should be tied to the inflation expectation thing, that if the inflation is rising, and if that's convincing, then the wage should rise, at least for that expectation part. And I put this into the sort of I call this as a reverse incomes policy. If you're old enough, you remember the President Nixon tried to persuade labor unions to accept the wage increase to be subdued because inflation is coming. So to convincing the labor that inflation is coming down, don't ask for too much wage increase. This is exactly the opposite. Inflation is rising, so that corporations should allow wages to go up. So if all succeed, this should work. So it's again whether the public is convinced by Mr. Abe and Mr. Kuroda that inflation is coming and wage increase should be implemented. And let's see whether big business will agree to this scenario.